Let us start with what caching is. So let's say there is a particular user and the user has requested for some data from our application. So what happens is the request comes onto our server and then the server queries our database to find or search for the data. Then we search the data from our database, the data gets returned to the server, and eventually from the server, the data gets returned to the user. This is the normal process, and this process works just fine for small scale applications. But the thing is, in case if we have a very large database, or in case our queries are very badly written, the database takes a lot of time to retrieve or to fetch our data or to return our data basically. And not only in case of bad queries, in general, if we require data to be fetched very fast from our database, that cannot be done because queries requires amount of time to get or to fetch data from a large database. So this process right here takes a much longer time and like it has a very high latency. So the user has to wait for some amount of time before he or she gets the data. But in real life scenarios, we have some applications where we require very fast retrieval of data. Let's say we have a stock market application. And in case of stock market application, we know that stock prices change every second or every half of a second, let's say. So in that case, if stock prices keep on changing, and let's say if our database takes 2 seconds to fetch the data, for just for example, if our database takes 2 seconds to fetch the data and then 2 seconds to update the data as well, then it is already a lot of time. And by that time, the price of the stock will change uh, for multiple times, right? So, of course, this process of data retrieval cannot be applied in this case of stock market application. We need much faster retrieval of data so that we can have the latest amount of information in a very short amount of time. For that purpose, we have something called caching. Basically, a cache memory is a separate memory from our database. It is a type of memory storage which helps us to retrieve data in a very fast manner. So we have something called a cache memory. Let's take Redis, which is the most commonly used cache memory. So a cache memory is nothing but a separate database or a separate storage kind of where we store fast or hot data. So what is hot data? Hot data is basically the type of data which is constantly requested from the user. Let's say if a data is constantly requested from the user, then we need to query our database every time and it will take a lot amount of time and it will overload our database, right? So the hot data or the data which is requested a lot from the client can be stored in something called as a cache memory. And in cache memory, basically the advantage is that we have a very fast retrieval of data. So whatever data is present in the cache memory, we have a very fast retrieval of data from cache. So if the server requests for data from cache, the cache, if it has the data, it returns the data in a very fast process. So it takes a lot lesser amount of time and has a very lower latency as compared to normal database operations of fetching. That is why we use cache. Now, for cache, we have very two common terminologies with cache, which are cache hit and cache miss. So let's see what these two terminologies are. Let's say we have our user right here. We have our cache memory and then we have our database. Database is compulsory, it cannot be replaced with cache. So the user needs some amount of data. And let's say we have defined a logic in our system that whatever the request which comes from the user, first we will uh, answer or like look for the data in cache. So for whatever request comes from the user, let's say first we look at our cache memory so that the data from the cache memory, if it is present, can be returned to the user in a very short amount of time. So we can have two cases in cache. Either the data is present or the data is not present. So in the first case where the data is present, the cache will directly send the data to the user, and this is the case of a cache hit. So in cache hit, basically we got a hit in our cache because the data was present in cache. So it very in a very fast manner, it retrieved the data and directly returned the data to our user. So this is known as a cache hit. But let's say the data is not present in cache. In that case, we have to look for the data in our main database, right? So then we have to query our database again, and the database then, after finding the data, will return the data to the cache, or let's say to the user. So if the data is not present in our cache memory and we have to query our database in that case, this case is known as a cache miss, because we had a miss in our cache memory. We did not have the data, so we had to query our database. And of course, logically, we can say that since data retrieval in cache is very fast, so if the data is already present, it would not require much time to retrieve the data and send it, right? So cache hit is much faster process. But in case of a cache miss, since we are querying the database again, so it is a much slower process as compared to cache hit. Because in cache miss, we have to query our database, then the data gets returned from the database to Redis, or let's say the user. So cache miss takes a lot amount of time, greater time as compared to cache hit. So these were the two basic terminologies which were attached with cache memory. And then we have another thing which is known as a TTL, or time to live. Now, cache memory is basically a type of memory where we store fast retrieval type data, right? We generally, the data which is stored in cache most of the times is temporary storage. We do not use cache memory for permanent storage. So for temporary storage of data, the data needs to be removed as well from the cache memory, right? So for that purpose, we have something called a time to live. So whenever we write in our cache, or whenever we like put data in our cache, then we also attach something called a time to live. It can be defined as indefinite as well, but generally for the temporary data that we write in our cache, we have something called TTL, and it is basically a time after which the data from the cache will be vanished. So for example, if in our cache we set the TTL to, let's say, 5 minutes, then after 5 minutes, the day, whatever data we wrote in the cache, for that data will be erased from cache. So basically, TTL describes after how much time the data is going to expire in our cache. Now, you may ask that, like, if we have something known as a cache memory, and if the cache memory is this fast and it gives data in such a lesser amount of time, so why don't we replace our database with cache memory? But this is a very common misconception, because we cannot replace our database entirely with cache. This is because of two major reasons mainly. First of all, like, we know that a cache is much faster, right? But we know that a cache memory is much faster. But since it is faster, it has a much smaller memory as well. So generally, cache memories are very small memories as compared to our database. So although it is a very fast type of memory, but we cannot store a large or hefty amount of data in our cache permanently, because it has a very small amount of memory. And the second reason is basically, like, cache has a very less amount of data which gets stored in it, right? Now, cache also has its limits. If we store a hefty amount of data in cache, then it is not always guaranteed that we get very fast retrieval of data from cache as well. If we store hefty amount of data, that is, if we store a large amount of data, then every time the data retrieval from cache is not as fast as in the ideal case, or like when we have lesser amount of data. So we if we store like a lot of amount of data in cache, and then if the responses become slow, then basically we are beating the whole purpose of caching, right? Because the whole purpose of caching was to get fast retrieval of data. So that is why we cannot replace our entire database with cache memory. And one of the most important points is that in cache memory, we store our data in the form of a key value pair. That is why the retrieval of data is so fast in a cache memory. A key is basically a constant, or like a fixed value, and a value is basically what we store in our or whatever the data that we are going to store here. So keys are always unique, and through keys we access the data, and value is whatever data that we need to store in our cache memory. So since we store it in key value form, so the data retrieval is much fast in cache memory.